Syro-Palestinian archaeology is a term used to refer to archaeological research conducted in the southern Levant. Palestinian archaeology is also commonly used in its stead, particularly when the area of inquiry centers on ancient Palestine. Besides its importance to the discipline of biblical archaeology, the region of ancient Palestine is one of the most important to an understanding of the history of the earliest peoples of the Stone Age. The geographical scope of Syro-Palestinian archaeology includes ancient southern central Syria, Israel and Palestine, both west and east of the Jordan River, or what was once known as ancient Greater Canaan. In modern-day terms, this comprises Israel, the Gaza Strip, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. The southern Levant's geographical location on the land bridge connecting Asia and Africa and its proximity to the cradle of humankind in Africa, and the ancient civilizations of the Near East has played a key role in determining the prehistory and history of social change in the region dating back over 1 million years. Though the term Syro-Palestinian archaeology is commonly employed by archaeologists in the southern Levant, it is rarely used by specialists in Syria itself. Syro-Palestinian archaeology is marked by a degree of acrimony not shared in other areas studies in the field that is often influenced by the complex politics of the region. Classical archaeologists who consider biblical scriptures to be legitimate historical documents have been attacked by alternative archaeologists who consider the data from excavations as being incompatible with the biblical historical record. The dispute led to a definitive split between classical archaeologists and Syro-Palestinian archaeologists in the 1970s, and continues to rage within the field of Syro-Palestinian and classical archaeology today. Terminology and scope. Syro-Palestinian archaeology is one of the terms used to refer to archaeological research conducted in the southern Levant. As an aspect of archaeology, it encompasses excavations, salvage, conservation and reconstruction efforts, as well as off-site research, interpretation, and other scholarship. The terminology for archaeology in the southern Levant has been defined in various, often competing or overlapping ways. Prior to and during the period of the British Mandate in Palestine, archaeology of the region was typically described as Palestinian archaeology or biblical archaeology. Under the influence of William F. Albright, biblical inquiry and narratives became increasingly important. Indeed, Albright conceived of Palestinian archaeology or Syro-Palestinian archaeology as a subfield of biblical archaeology. The archaeology of ancient Israel is described by Franken and Franken-Battershill as but a small part of the far greater study of Palestinian archaeology, in a primer of Old Testament archaeology. While both classical archaeology and Syro-Palestinian archaeology deal with the same general region of study, the focus and approach of these interrelated disciplines differs. Even scholars who have continued to advocate a role for classical archaeology have accepted the existence of a general branch of Syro-Palestinian archaeology. In addition, classical archaeology may cover areas relevant to the Bible outside of the southern Levant, and it takes into account the use and explanation of biblical texts, which Syro-Palestinian archaeologists ignore. Beyond its importance to the discipline of classical archaeology, the region of the southern Levant is critical for an understanding of the history of the earliest peoples of the Stone Age. In academic, political, and public settings, the region's archaeology can also be described in terms of ancient or modern Israel, Jordan, Palestine and Syria. Archaeologists may define the geographic range more narrowly, especially for inquiries that focus on Israel or Palestine, whether construed as ancient or modern territories. The shifting terminology over the past 50 years reflects political tensions that operate within and upon the field. Temporal scope from prehistoric times through the Iron Age. Chronological periods are usually named in keeping with technological developments that characterize that era. From the Babylonian era onward, naming is based on historical events. Scholars often disagree on the exact dates and terminology to be used for each period. Some definitions for the temporal scope, particularly earlier on, tended to exclude events after the Byzantine period. But the temporal scope of Syro-Palestinian archaeology has expanded over the years. In 1982, James A. Sauer wrote that the Islamic periods were part of Syro-Palestinian archaeological research, and that while some periods had been ignored, neglected, or even discarded for the sake of other periods, it is now an almost universally accepted principle that archaeological evidence from all periods must be treated with equal care. Leslie J. Hopper, writing in 1987, submits that Dever's definition of temporal scope of Syro-Palestinian archaeology excludes the early Arab period, the Crusader period, the Mamluk period and the Ottoman period. However, Dever's definition of the temporal scope of the field in What Did the Biblical Writers Know, and When Did They Know It, indicates that Hopp's critique is no longer valid. There, Dever writes that the time frame of Syro-Palestinian archaeology extends far beyond the biblical period, embracing everything from the Lower Paleolithic to the Ottoman period. The list below, from the Paleolithic Age to the Byzantine period, is drawn from the definitions provided by the Mercer Dictionary of the Bible. For periods thereafter, the terminology and dates come from Sauer and Hopper. Prehistory Paleolithic Age equals 1,500,000 minus 14,000 BCE. Epipaleolithic Age equals 14,000 minus 8,000 BCE. Neolithic Age equals 8,000 minus 4,500 BCE. Chalcolithic Age equals 4,500 minus 3,200 BCE. Bronze Age Early Bronze Age equals 3,200 minus 2,200 BCE. EBIV Intermediate Bronze equals 2,200 minus 2,000. Middle Bronze Age equals 2,200 minus 1,550 BCE. MBI equals 2,000 to 1,750 megabytes. 2 equals 1,750 minus 1,550. Late Bronze Age equals 1,550 minus 1,200 BCE. Pound I equals 1,550 minus 1,400. Pound 2 equals 1,400 minus 1,200. Iron Age equals 1,200 minus 586 BCE. Iron I equals 1,200 minus 980. I and IIA equals 980 to 830. I and IIB equals 830 to 721. I and IIC equals 721 to 586. Babylonian period equals 586-539 BCE. Persian period equals 539-332 BCE. Hellenistic period equals 332-63 BCE. Early Hellenistic equals 332 to 198. Late Hellenistic equals 198 to 63. Roman period equals 63 BCE to 324 CE. Early Roman equals 63 BCE to 135 CE. Late Roman equals 135-324 CE. Byzantine period equals 324-640 CE. Islamic period equals 630-1918 CE. Early Arab period equals 640-1099 CE. Crusader period equals 1099 to 1291 CE. Mamluk period equals 1250 to 1517 CE. Ottoman period equals 1517 to 1918 CE. Origins. Modern Palestinian archaeology began in the late 19th century. Early expeditions lacked standardized methods for re-excavation and interpretation, and were often little more than treasure hunting expeditions. A lack of awareness of the importance of stratigraphy and dating objects led to digging long trenches through the middle of a site that made work by later archaeologists more difficult. Edward Robinson identified numerous sites from antiquity and published his findings with Eli Smith in a pivotal 3-volume study entitled Biblical Researches in Palestine and the Adjacent Regions. Journal of Travels in the year 1838. In Syria, Ernest Renan carried out research in the 1860s, and Howard Crosby Butler of Princeton University carried out surveys of Byzantine Christian sites. In the early 1900s, major projects were set up at Samaria, Gaza, Megiddo and Jericho. An early school of modern Palestinian archaeology was led by William F. Albright, whose work focused on biblical narratives. Albright himself held that Frederick Jones Bliss was the father of Palestinian archaeology, although Bliss is not well known in the field. Geoffrey A. Blakely attributes this to Bliss' successor at the Palestine Exploration Fund, RAS, McAllister, who underplayed his predecessor's achievements. While the importance of stratigraphy, typology and Bork grew in the mid-20th century, the continued tendency to ignore hard data in favor of subjective interpretations invited criticism. Paul W. Lapp, for example, who many thought would take up the mantle of Albright before his premature death in 1970, wrote, "Too much of Palestinian archaeology is an inflated fabrication, too often a subjective interpretation, not based on empirical stratigraphic observation, is used to demonstrate the validity of another subjective interpretation. We assign close dates to a group of pots on subjective typological grounds and go on to cite our opinion as independent evidence for similarly dating a parallel group. Too much of Palestinian archaeology's foundation building has involved chasing ad hominem arguments around in a circle." In 1974, William Dever established the secular, non-biblical school of Syro-Palestinian archaeology and mounted a series of attacks on the very definition of biblical archaeology. Dever argued that the name of such inquiry should be changed to archaeology of the Bible, or archaeology of the biblical period, to delineate the narrow temporal focus of biblical archaeologists. Frank Moorcross, who had studied under Albright and had taught Dever, emphasized that in Albright's view biblical archaeology was not synonymous with Palestinian archaeology, but rather that William Foxwell Albright regarded Palestinian archaeology or Syro-Palestinian archaeology as a small, if important section of biblical archaeology. One finds it ironical that recent students suppose them interchangeable terms. Dever agreed that the terms were not interchangeable, but claimed that Syro-Palestinian archaeology is not the same as the biblical archaeology. I regret to say that all who would defend Albright and biblical archaeology on this ground are sadly out of touch with reality in the field of archaeology. Towards the end of the 20th century, Palestinian archaeology or Syro-Palestinian archaeology became a more interdisciplinary practice. Specialists in archaeozoology, archaeobotany, geology, anthropology and epigraphy now work together to produce essential environmental and non-environmental data in multidisciplinary projects. Foci in Syro-Palestinian archaeology. Ceramics analysis. A central concern of Syro-Palestinian archaeology since its genesis has been the study of ceramics. Whole pots and richly decorated pottery are uncommon in the Levant, and the plainer, less ornate ceramic artifacts of the region have served the analytical goals of archaeologists, much more than those of museum collectors. The ubiquity of pottery sherds and their long history of use in the region makes ceramics analysis a particularly useful subdiscipline of Syro-Palestinian archaeology, used to address issues of terminology and periodization. Awareness of the value of pottery gained early recognition in a landmark survey conducted by Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, whose findings were published in first two works on the subject, Biblical Researches in Palestine and later Biblical Researches. Ceramics analysis in Syro-Palestinian archaeology has suffered from insularity and conservatism, due to the legacy of what J. P. Dessel and Alexander H. Joffe call the imperial hubris of panoptic biblical archaeology. The dominance of biblical archaeological approaches meant that the subdiscipline was cut off from other branches of ancient Near Eastern studies. Apart from occasional references to Northwest Semitic epigraphy and Assyriology, as exemplified in the Mesha Stela, the Sphire Stelae, and the Tel Dan Stela. As a result, widely varying principles, emphases, and definitions are used to determine local typologies among archaeologists working in the region. Attempts to identify and bridge the gaps made some headway at the Durham Conference, though it was recognized that agreement on a single method of ceramic analysis or a single definition of a type may not be possible. The solution proposed by Dessel and Joffe is for all archaeologists in the field to provide more explicit descriptions of the objects that they study. The more information provided and shared between those in related subdisciplines, the more likely it is that they will be able to identify and understand the commonalities in the different typological systems. Defining Phoenician Syro-Palestinian archaeology also includes the study of Phoenician culture, cosmopolitan in character and widespread in its distribution in the region. According to Benjamin Sass and Christoph U. Eilinger, the questions of what is actually Phoenician and what is specifically Phoenician in Phoenician iconography constitute one well-known crux of Syro-Palestinian archaeology. Without answers to these questions, the authors contend that research exploring the degree to which Phoenician art and symbolism penetrated into the different areas of Syria and Palestine will make little progress.